Alright, let's go. Number 10. Nataruk. In 2012, a research team led by the Cambridge paleoanthropologist Marta Mirazan-Lar was surveying the dry lakebed country west of Lake Turkana in Kenya. They were not looking for a massacre. They were looking for old shorelines. What they found, eroding out of a bank near a spot called Nataruk, was a skeleton lying face down with its hands apparently bound, then another. Then 25 more. By the time the excavation was finished, and the study published in Nature in 2016, the team had documented at least 27 individuals, men, women, and at least 6 children, scattered across a lagoon shore that had dried up roughly 10,000 years ago. 12 of the skeletons were still articulated enough to read the violence directly off the bone. Skulls caved in by blunt weapons. Ribs punctured by sharp points. One skull still had a stone projectile lodged inside it. A pregnant woman lay with her hands and feet arranged as though they had been tied. This was not a burial. Nobody dug graves for these people. Their bodies were left where they fell, on the shore of a lagoon, and the sediment simply closed over them. What makes Nataruk difficult to file away is who these people were. They were not farmers defending stored grain, and they were not soldiers of a state. They were hunter-gatherers, foragers living in small mobile bands, at a site old enough to sit right at the edge of the last hunter-gatherer world, before agriculture reorganized how humans lived. For decades, one influential idea in anthropology held that organized group violence was a side effect of settled life, of surplus, of property worth defending. Nataruk does not fit that story. Here were people with no granaries and no walls, apparently ambushed and killed in a group a full 10 millennia ago. Sit with the arithmetic for a moment, because this is where the comparison that opens this list actually starts to make sense. A band of hunter-gatherers in this period is estimated, from ethnographic analogs, to number somewhere in the range of 20 to 40 people. If something like this group of 27 represented even a large fraction of a single community, then whoever did this did not just win a fight, they may have erased a society. Working from studies like the 2009 analysis published in Science by the economist Samuel Bowles, some anthropologists have argued that mortality from intergroup violence in prehistoric societies could run as high as 20, even 30% of all deaths in a population, a rate that dwarfs the roughly 3% of the world's population killed across the entire Second World War, not in absolute numbers. In the only number that mattered, if you were the one standing on that lagoon shore. The odds that violence, not old age, would be how your story ended. Not everyone accepts the numbers at Nataruk without a fight of their own. A handful of researchers have argued the site could represent a single opportunistic raid rather than proof of habitual warfare, and that 10,000-year-old sediment makes the taphonomy, the way bodies settle and are preserved, difficult to read with total confidence. The honest position is that we have one exceptional site, extraordinarily well preserved, and we do not know how typical it was. There is a second detail from Nataruk that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it might be the more important one. Obsidian, the volcanic glass used for some of the cutting weapons at the site, does not occur naturally anywhere near Nataruk. It had to be carried in from a source many kilometers away. Whoever attacked that lagoon shore did not grab whatever was lying around. They came prepared with weapons made specifically to kill people, not animals. That single fact is why some researchers treat Nataruk not as an unusually violent hunting accident or a domestic dispute gone wrong, but as the earliest physical evidence we have of something closer to organized war, planning, travel, and purpose-built weapons aimed at another group of human beings, 10,000 years before anyone wrote a word down. What we do know is that 27 people who should have simply lived out their lives on the shore of an African lake instead became the oldest clear evidence of group violence between human beings that has ever been found. The lagoon dried up long ago. The people did not get to. Number 9. Jebel Sahaba. In 1965, the American archaeologist Fred Wendorf, the same man who would spend the later decades of his career pulling an entire desert civilization out of the sand at Nabta Playa, was surveying the Nile Valley in northern Sudan ahead of the flooding that would follow the construction of the Aswan High Dam. At a site called Jebel Sahaba, his team uncovered a cemetery. Cemetery 117, they called it. Inside were the remains of at least 61 people, and the site was old, roughly 13,000 years old, among the earliest organized cemeteries known anywhere on Earth. Nearly half of the skeletons carried the marks of violence. Stone projectile points embedded directly in bone, cut marks on limbs and skulls consistent with close combat. Some individuals had been struck more than a dozen times. For decades after its discovery, Jebel Sahaba was treated as the textbook example of prehistoric warfare, a single catastrophic battle at the dawn of the Nile Valley's earliest cultures, possibly triggered by the population pressure of a shrinking green corridor as the Sahara around it began drying into desert. Then, in 2001, the picture changed again. A team led by the archaeologist Isabelle Crevecoeur, working with new imaging techniques that could examine each wound far more closely than Wendorf's generation could, published new analysis in scientific reports. What they found was not one battle, it was many. The wounds on the Jebel Sahaba skeletons showed different stages of healing. Some people carried old, healed injuries layered under fresh, fatal ones. This was not a single afternoon of slaughter. It looked like a cemetery filling up over generations through repeated raids, ambushes, and skirmishes between neighboring groups competing for a shrinking strip of fertile land along a river that was becoming the only reliable water source for hundreds of miles in every direction. That reframing matters because it changes the shape of the horror. A single massacre is a single terrible day, a cemetery filling up generation after generation with the casualties of chronic low-grade raiding is something closer to a permanent condition of life passed from parent to child for as long as anyone in that valley could remember. Historians of the 20th century sometimes describe World War II's death toll as a percentage of the world's population at the time, a figure usually placed near 3%. Nobody can calculate an equivalent percentage for the total population strung out along the Nile 13,000 years ago, because we do not know how many people there were to begin with. What the bones at Jebel Sahaba suggest is a world in which violent death was not a catastrophic exception. It was simply how a meaningful share of that population's men, women, and children were expected to die. There is also a haunting practical detail buried in the 2021 reanalysis. Several of the projectile points recovered from the wounds were made from a distinctive local stone, meaning the killers, in at least some of the attacks, were probably not strangers passing through. They were neighbors. People who knew the paths along the river, who understood exactly when a rival group would be gathered at the water's edge, harvesting or fishing, and vulnerable. That is a harder thing to sit with than a single foreign raid. It suggests a world where the greatest danger to a family was not some distant, unknowable enemy, but the people camped a few days' walk upriver who had killed a cousin last season and would very likely be killed by that cousin's relatives the season after. The Nile still runs past the site today, wider and calmer than it has any memory of being cruel. Cemetery 117 itself is gone now, submerged under Lake Nasser, along with everything else the dam swallowed. We have the records Wendorf made before the water came. We do not have the names of anyone who was ambushed there, or the reasons anyone gave for why it kept happening, generation after generation, until it stopped. Number 8. The Linear Pottery War. In 1983, workers cutting a new water pipeline near the village of Talheim in southern Germany struck bone. Archaeologists were called in, and what they uncovered was a pit containing the remains of 34 people, men, women, and at least 16 children, dumped together with no grave goods and no ceremony. The skulls showed depressed fractures from stone adzes, the everyday tool used to fell trees and work wood. Several individuals had been shot with arrows, and the angle of the wounds on some skeletons suggested they had been struck while running away. This was not a battle. It was an execution. The people at Talheim belonged to the linear pottery culture, the LBK, one of the first farming societies to spread across Central Europe, roughly 7,000 years ago. For a long time, the LBK was treated as an image of Neolithic tranquility. Small timber longhouses, painted pottery, the slow, peaceful spread of agriculture across a continent of foragers. Talheim broke that image, and it turned out not to be alone. At Schletz, near the town of Aspern and Derzaya in Austria, excavations beginning in 1983 under the archaeologist Helmut Wendel uncovered a defensive ditch ringing an entire LBK settlement, and inside that ditch, the remains of more than 100 people, thrown in without burial, their skulls smashed. And in 2006, construction near Kilianstetten in Germany turned up another mass grave. This one holding at least 26 individuals, whose lower leg bones had been deliberately broken, likely after death, in what the archaeologist Christian Meyer and his colleagues argued in a 2015 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, may have been an act meant to prevent the dead from being useful even as ancestors, a final act of erasure aimed at an entire community, 3 sites, 3 entire settlements wiped out over a span of centuries, across a few hundred kilometers of the same farming culture. Population reconstructions of the LBK world, built from painstaking counts of longhouses and burial density by researchers like Andreas Zimmermann, suggest that Central Europe's earliest farming communities were not smoothly growing outward. They were expanding, then crashing in waves, and the mass graves line up with some of the sharpest of those crashes. Nobody can put a precise body count on the Linear Pottery War, because it was never one war. It was a pattern repeating itself at the edges of a spreading agricultural frontier, community by community, for as long as there was new land worth killing over. One more detail from Talheim deserves its own moment, because it complicates the picture rather than simplifying it. Isotope analysis of the teeth from several skeletons in the pit, published years after the initial excavation, showed that some of the dead had grown up eating food from soil, chemically different from the ground around Talheim itself. In other words, at least some of the people slaughtered there were not lifelong locals. They may have been immigrants, or a group that had recently moved into the area, killed by a resident population defending land and resources against newcomers, rather than the reverse. Archaeologists still argue over which direction the arrow of aggression pointed. What nobody argues over is that 34 people, most of them related, all of them living in the same handful of longhouses, died together and were thrown into the same pit without a single grave good to mark who they had been. The honest summary is that we cannot say what the total was. What we can say is that in at least 3 places, entire villages, children included, were exterminated down to the last person, and that whoever did it did not consider that fact worth hiding. Number 7, the Bronze Age collapse. In 1929, the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer began excavating a mound on the Syrian coast called Ras Shamra. Underneath it was Ugarit, a wealthy Bronze Age trading city, and among the thousands of clay tablets his team eventually recovered was one that had never been sent. It was found still sitting in a kiln, baked hard by the very fire that destroyed the city around it. It is a letter from Ugarit's last king, Amurapi, pleading for help. Enemy ships, he writes, have been sighted at sea. His own fleet and army are away, deployed elsewhere against a different threat. The city has no defense left. Ugarit was destroyed and never resettled. And it was not alone. Across a span of roughly 50 years around 1200 BCE, nearly every major power center in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East went down in the same rough window. Mycenaean Pylos in Greece, Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, cities across Cyprus and the Levant, even Egypt, which survived, but was permanently weakened after repelling repeated invasions by a coalition Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples. The historian Eric Klein, whose 2014 book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, gave the event its popular name, describes it as a systems collapse, not a single war with a single enemy, but a cascading failure of trade networks, climate, earthquakes, and invasion feeding on each other until an entire interconnected civilization came apart at once. The scale is almost impossible to convert into a single casualty figure, and that difficulty is itself the point. This was not one campaign. It was every campaign, everywhere, all at once, for 2 full generations. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were burned and never rebuilt. Trade routes that had linked Egypt to Anatolia to Mesopotamia went dark. Writing itself disappeared in some regions. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, vanishes from the record entirely, and Greece would not write again for centuries. Estimates of urban population loss across the region during the collapse run as high as 75% in some of the hardest hit areas, a figure drawn from settlement surveys comparing the density of late Bronze Age sites to what followed, Whether the total number of people who died by violence, as opposed to famine, disease, or simple displacement, would rival the deaths of the Second World War, is a question the evidence cannot answer with any precision. What is not in dispute is that an entire interlocking civilization, the most sophisticated the world had yet built, came apart within the span of 2 generations, and that at every excavated layer marking that collapse, there is a burn line. Klein himself has been careful, in later interviews and editions of his book, to resist turning the collapse into a single simple story of invasion. Drought evidence from Cyprus and the Levant, recovered from ancient pollen cores, suggests decades of failing harvests in the same window as the destructions, which would have driven displaced populations to raid their neighbors for food, which would in turn have driven those neighbors to raid someone else, a chain reaction, with no single villain and no single victim. That is, if anything, a more disturbing model than a straightforward war, because it means the destruction of an entire civilizational network was not the result of one enemy's ambition. It was the result of an interconnected world discovering, all at once, how fragile that interconnection actually was. Ugarit's king wrote his last letter and never got to send it. Nobody who has read it since has needed him to finish the sentence. Number 6. The Yellow Turban Rebellion and the Three Kingdoms Wars. The Book of Han, the official dynastic history of the Han dynasty, records a census taken in the year 2 CE. It puts the population of China at just under 58 million people. The Book of Jin, the history covering the dynasty that reunified the country in 280 CE, records another census. It counts fewer than 17 million. In between those two numbers sits one of the most violent stretches in Chinese history. The Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 CE, a peasant uprising against a corrupt and crumbling Han court, followed by nearly a century of civil war among the warlords and eventual three kingdoms who carved up the empire in the chaos that followed. Famine and plague tore through the same decades. Armies of hundreds of thousands marched back and forth across the North China Plain. Cities were depopulated, and some regions once dense with farms are described in contemporary accounts as returning to wilderness within a single generation. Right at face value, the gap between those two census figures, something over 40 million people, has made its way into more than one popular ranking of history's deadliest events, sometimes cited as evidence that the wars following the Yellow Turban Rebellion killed more people than the Second World War. It is a genuinely staggering number, and it deserves exactly the scrutiny historians have given it. Most specialists in the period do not believe the raw gap between the censuses is a body count. A Han census was a tax and conscription record, and it counted registered households, the people a magistrate could actually find and tax. During decades of collapsing central authority, enormous numbers of families simply vanished from the official rolls, not because they died, but because they fled into the mountains, attached themselves to the private estates of powerful landowners who kept their own people off the books, or scattered into regions the shrinking bureaucracy no longer reached. Historians like the demographer Kang Chao have argued that unregistered population, not mass death, explains the greater part of the drop. That correction does not make the period bloodless. Even conservative reconstructions still put the death toll from war, famine, and disease across this stretch in the many millions, among the worst human-caused mortality events in the ancient world, concentrated in a region that, at its start, held perhaps a fifth of everyone alive on Earth. The honest number sits somewhere between a horrifying multi-million person catastrophe and an even more horrifying multi-tens of millions one, and no one now living can tell you exactly where in that range the truth falls. What is not in dispute, and what the popular rankings tend to leave out, is the human texture underneath the statistics. Contemporary accounts from the period describe entire counties reduced to a handful of surviving households, roads abandoned to the point that travelers reported going days without meeting another living person, and a wave of cannibalism during the worst famine years, so widely reported across multiple independent chronicles that modern historians treat it as broadly credible rather than mere hyperbole. Whatever the precise number of dead, the people who lived through the interval between those two censuses did not experience it as an accounting discrepancy. They experienced it as the end of the world they had grown up in. The census takers of 280 CE were not trying to write a memorial. They were trying to figure out who was left to tax. It is our discomfort, reading it 16 centuries later, that turns their tally into something closer to an epitaph. Number 5. The An Lushan Rebellion. Tang Dynasty China, in the middle of the 8th century, was arguably the wealthiest, most cosmopolitan empire on earth. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world. Its census records, kept with a bureaucratic thoroughness the Han Dynasty would have envied, counted the population at just under 53 million people in the year 754. In 755, a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic descent named An Lushan, a favorite of the emperor turned rival to the court, rose in revolt at the head of an army recruited from the northern frontier. The rebellion that followed tore through the empire's richest provinces for 8 years. Chang'an itself was sacked. The emperor fled. Armies of hundreds of thousands fought pitched battles across the North China Plain, and the fighting was compounded, as it so often was in this period, by famine that followed the destruction of granaries and irrigation works the war left in ruins. The census taken in 764, the year after the rebellion was finally suppressed, counted fewer than 17 million people. That number, roughly 36 million fewer people on the books than a decade earlier, has traveled a long way through popular history. It shows up in rankings compiled by writers like Matthew White, whose comparative surveys of historical mass death events have been widely cited online, sometimes described as evidence that the An Lushan Rebellion killed a larger fraction of the world's population than any conflict in history before the 20th century, larger, proportionally, than the Second World War itself. As with the fall of the Han, most historians of Tang China treat the raw census gap with real caution. Registration collapsed across huge parts of the empire as local governments lost the ability to count anyone at all, and a significant share of the missing millions were almost certainly alive, just no longer on a government ledger, scattered into regions the shattered bureaucracy could no longer reach. But even scholars skeptical of the full 36 million figure generally accept that the rebellion and the famine it triggered killed people by the millions in one of the wealthiest, most densely populated regions on the planet within less than a single decade. There is a literary footnote to the rebellion that, in its own quiet way, says as much as any census. The great Tang poet Du Fu lived through the entire 8-year catastrophe, and his surviving verses from the period describe abandoned villages, conscription officers dragging away the elderly because every younger man was already dead or gone, and roads littered with bodies no one had the strength left to bury. Du Fu was not a statistician. He was a man watching his own world come apart in real time, and centuries of Chinese readers have turned to his poems precisely because the raw census numbers, whatever their true scale, cannot convey what he could in a handful of lines. What is left of the An Lushan Rebellion today is mostly paperwork, 2 censuses, a gap between them, and centuries of argument about how much of that gap was a grave and how much was simply a family that stopped answering when the tax collector called. Nobody who was actually there to answer that question is left to ask. Number 4. The Conquests of Timur. In 1387, after a rebellion in the Persian city of Isfahan, the conqueror Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, ordered a reprisal. Chroniclers writing decades and centuries later describe the result. Tens of thousands of severed heads built into towers as a monument at the city's gates. It was not the only time he did this. After the sack of Baghdad in 1401, and again after his invasion of Delhi in 1398, similar towers reportedly rose outside the walls of cities that had resisted him. Timur built an empire stretching from the edge of the Ottoman world to the borders of China, and he built it through campaigns of calculated, theatrical destruction. Cities that surrendered quickly were sometimes spared. Cities that resisted were frequently annihilated, their populations killed, enslaved, or driven out, their monuments toppled, and, in more than one case, deliberately never rebuilt. Modern historians, who have attempted to total the death toll of his roughly 35 years of campaigning, among them the same Matthew White, whose comparative rankings of mass death events have shaped a great deal of popular history, arrive at a figure in the neighborhood of 17 million people. On its own, that number is smaller than the death toll of the Second World War. But the comparison that matters here is proportional, not absolute. The world's population in Timur's lifetime is estimated at somewhere around 350 to 375 million people. 17 million dead against that total works out to roughly 5% of everyone alive on Earth. A proportional death rate higher than the roughly 3% the Second World War inflicted on a global population that, by the 1940s, had grown to more than 2 billion. The skull towers themselves are gone. None have survived in place for archaeologists to excavate. They exist only in the written accounts of chroniclers, several of them writing for patrons with every reason to exaggerate a conqueror's terror. That uncertainty is worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. We do not have Timur's own death tolls. Only the numbers his enemies and his court historians chose to remember, and the two rarely agree. What survives instead is a landscape. Cities across Persia and Central Asia that had thrived for centuries before Timur's armies arrived, and that either never recovered their former size or vanished from the map altogether. Archaeological surveys of the irrigation systems that once fed cities like Merv, itself sacked earlier by the Mongols and then caught again in Timur's later campaigns, show canal networks abandoned and never fully rebuilt. Agricultural land that had supported dense populations for 1,000 years reverting slowly to desert. A conqueror does not need an accurate census to leave a permanent scar. He only needs enough time, and Timur had 35 years. Number 3. The Taiping Rebellion. In 1851, a failed civil service candidate from Guangdong province named Hong Xiuquan, after a nervous breakdown and a series of visions he came to interpret as evidence he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, declared the founding of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom and launched a rebellion against the ruling Qing dynasty. What followed was, by most reckonings, the deadliest civil war in human history. For 14 years, Taiping and Qing armies fought across central and southern China through some of the most densely populated farmland on Earth. Cities changed hands repeatedly, and each change of hands frequently meant mass execution of the losing side's population. The rebellion's capital at Nanjing held out for over a decade before falling to Qing forces in 1864 in a final assault that contemporary accounts describe as ending in the deliberate slaughter of most of the city's remaining population rather than allowing surrender. Modern demographic reconstructions, including detailed provincial studies by the Chinese historian Cao Shuji, comparing pre-rebellion and post-rebellion population registers province by province, put the total death toll from combat, massacre, and the famine and disease that followed the destruction of farmland and irrigation across entire provinces at somewhere between 20 and 30 million people. Some of the worst affected provinces, Jiangsu and Zhejiang, may have lost the majority of their population within a single decade. Even at the lower end of that range, the Taiping Rebellion killed more people than any single nation lost in the Second World War, with the notable exceptions of China and the Soviet Union. At the upper end, its toll approaches the lower estimates for total civilian and military deaths across the entire global conflict of the 1940s, concentrated not across 6 years and every inhabited continent, but within one country over roughly the same span of time. What makes the number harder to hold on to is how ordinary its cause looks in hindsight. One man's religious delusion, arriving at a moment when Qing authority was already weak and rural poverty already severe, given 14 years and an army to work with. Historians still argue over how much of the death toll was direct violence and how much was the famine that violence produced, the same argument that recurs in almost every entry on this list. Provinces that had fed tens of millions of people for centuries were, within a decade, feeding almost no one at all. The rice paddies are still there today, green again, worked by descendants of the people who survived, farming ground that, for one brief and terrible stretch of the 19th century, was mostly empty. Number 2. The Ming-Qing Transition. In 1644, the Ming dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, collapsed. A peasant rebel leader took Beijing. The last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree behind the palace rather than be captured, and a Manchu army from beyond the Great Wall, invited in by a Ming general to help crush the rebels, took the opportunity to seize the throne for itself instead. What followed was nearly 40 years of conquest, rebellion, and reprisal as the new Qing dynasty fought to subdue a country that did not want to submit to it. The worst of it fell on cities that resisted. At Yangzhou in 1645, Qing forces under the General Dodo besieged the city for less than a week before it fell. What happened next was recorded in unusually graphic detail by a survivor named Wang Shuchu, whose account, A Record of 10 Days at Yangzhou, describes a massacre lasting roughly 10 days, with bodies piled in the streets and canals choked with the dead. Later Chinese estimates placed the death toll at Yangzhou alone somewhere between several hundred thousand and, by some accounts, close to 1 million people in a single city in under 2 weeks. Yangzhou was not unique. Sichuan province, in particular, suffered a demographic collapse so severe during these decades, from a combination of massacre, famine, and the chaos left by a locally notorious warlord named Zhang Xianzhong, that later Qing governments had to organize mass resettlement campaigns, moving millions of people from other provinces into Sichuan simply to repopulate farmland that had gone entirely empty. Modern demographic historians estimate the total death toll of the Ming-Qing Transition across its full 4 decades of war at somewhere in the range of 25 million people, a figure built from provincial tax registers, local gazetteers, and the resettlement records that followed. Wang Shuchu's account of Yangzhou survived only by accident. It was banned and suppressed for over 2 centuries under Qing rule, precisely because it was too accurate about how the dynasty had come to power, and it circulated only in secret copies until it resurfaced in the 19th century. Most of what happened in those 40 years was never written down at all, or was written down and then deliberately destroyed by a government that had every reason not to want it remembered. What we have is the arithmetic left in tax rolls that suddenly, provincially, stop adding up, and one smuggled account of 10 days in one city, kept alive specifically because someone thought the world should not be allowed to forget it. Number 1. The Mongol Conquests. In 1258, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a general named Hulagu, brought a Mongol army to the gates of Baghdad, then the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The city fell within days. What followed, according to multiple contemporary chroniclers, was a week of systematic slaughter. The House of Wisdom, Baghdad's great library, was destroyed, and later writers claimed the Tigris ran black with ink from the books thrown into it, and red with blood, for days afterward. Estimates of the dead at Baghdad alone range from the low hundreds of thousands into the millions, and the caliph himself was executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses so that no royal blood would touch the ground. Baghdad was one city, in one campaign, inside a conquest that began with Genghis Khan's unification of the Mongol tribes in 1206 and continued, under his sons and grandsons, for over a century and a half, across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Cities across Central Asia that resisted the Mongol advance, Merv, Nishapur, Herat, Bukhara, were subjected to campaigns of destruction so thorough that some regional populations, by the account of the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing within a generation of the events, never recovered their pre-conquest numbers at all. Modern historians, who have attempted to total the death toll across the full span of the Mongol conquests, generally arrive at a figure between 30 and 40 million people, with some estimates running as high as 60 million against a world population at the time, usually placed somewhere around 360 to 400 million. Even the conservative end of that range puts the proportional death toll of the Mongol conquests on par with, and by some reconstructions above, the roughly 3% of humanity killed across the entire Second World War. 2 pieces of modern science make the scale of this almost unbearably concrete. In 2003, a team of geneticists led by Tatiana Zerjal, publishing in the American Journal of Human Genetics, identified a single extraordinarily widespread Y chromosome lineage carried by roughly 8% of men across a broad swath of Asia today. Some 16 million living men, all descended, the team concluded, from a single male line traceable to the era and geography of Genghis Khan himself. It remains one of the most striking pieces of evidence ever produced that one individual, and the empire he founded, altered the genetic makeup of a meaningful fraction of the human species. And in 2011, a team of climate scientists led by Julia Pongratz publishing in the Holocene, calculated that the depopulation and abandoned farmland left across Eurasia by the Mongol Conquests allowed enough forest regrowth to pull a measurable quantity of carbon dioxide out of the Earth's atmosphere, one of the only events in human history significant enough to leave a detectable fingerprint on the planet's climate before the industrial era began. Sit with both of those facts side by side. A war violent enough to be written into the DNA of tens of millions of living men, and violent enough, through the sheer scale of the emptied land it left behind, to be written into the composition of the air. Historians will keep arguing over the exact death toll for as long as historians exist to argue, because no one in the 13th century was taking a careful global census in the middle of an invasion. But the evidence no longer lives only in chronicles that might exaggerate, or in tax rolls that might undercount. It lives in ice cores, in tree rings, and in the blood of millions of people alive today who will never know the name of the war that put it there. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.